The first thing anyone remembered about Clara Bellows was that she stepped off the freight wagon with nothing but a pale suitcase and a canvas sack that looked like it belonged in an orchard. It was mid-autumn, dust clinging to the sky like the town had never known rain, and she didn't even pause when her boots touched ground, just walked straight past the gawking men on the porch of the feed store, her head covered in a checked bonnet that flapped in the wind like a loose flag. The town barely gave her a week before they started whispering she wouldn't last the winter. She had answered a mail-order bride notice posted by a widower named Callum Rigg, a man who'd lost his first wife 2 winters prior to fever. Callum was known for his tobacco-stained teeth and one half-frozen ear, and for the way he chewed every bite like it was a chore. He didn't talk much, didn't drink, didn't hit. That was about as good a match as a woman could expect that far north of the Platte River, and Clara didn't complain. She moved into his small homestead on the edge of town, a squat one-room house with a lean-to stable and a smokehouse that hadn't been used since the war. Most assumed she'd fall apart before December. She was thin, too pale, soft-skinned, not roughened like the women who'd been born to that land. No calluses, no meat on her bones. No loud voice. She barely spoke in the store, just handed her coins and walked home. And when she started buying sacks of fruit in late October, apricots, apples, currants, gooseberries, even plums hauled in from back east, the laughter began. "Fruit don't keep out here?" "Not unless you pickle it in brine," Old Man Rourke told her in line at the general store. "You dry all that, and the mice'll have it chewed before January." But she didn't answer, just nodded slightly, and kept moving, like she hadn't come all that way just to be lectured by a man who hadn't swept his porch since Lincoln was alive. What no one understood was this. Clara had grown up watching her mother store for hard winters back in the Appalachian hollows, in a world where a late freeze could steal a child's last breath. Her family had dried fruit not in ovens or shallow pans, but in cloth-wrapped bundles, hanging high above the reach of mice, packed with herbs and sealed with lard-soaked cloth. The method wasn't in books, it was in bone, in memory. She knew what she was doing. In secret, she worked from dawn until after sunset. She strung apple slices on thread and hung them from nails driven into the rafters. She laid wild currants out on burlap in the upper loft where the wind could find them through the chimney flue. She soaked plums in boiling water, skinned them, split them, dried them into leathery half-moons that looked like shriveled hearts and smelled sweet even in the dark. She dried apricots in layers, pressed between boards with warm stones on top, changing them every few hours. By mid-November, Callum's cabin smelled like a cider house. The roof beams sagged under the weight of strung fruit, the shelves stacked with jars lined in cheesecloth and oil-soaked parchment. Callum didn't argue. He was a man of dry habits and quiet winters, and he seemed to appreciate her industry, though even he didn't quite understand it. "You ain't expecting famine, are you?" he asked one night, poking his soup with a spoon. Clara looked at him over the rim of her cup. "No," she said, "just winter." He grunted and left it at that. The town didn't. The jokes became regular. Some men nicknamed her Fruit Widow, even though she wasn't one. Others joked about making pies all winter if she'd only share. One woman, Ruby Marston, who considered herself the moral backbone of the women's circle, muttered within earshot, if she spent half that time making a proper quilt, she'd freeze slower when the fruit turned to rot. Clara didn't answer. She didn't waste time proving anything. The ones who jeered had cellars full of moldy potatoes and turnips gone soft. Clara kept working, not for approval, but because a voice in her heart kept whispering, "It's coming," and it came. It wasn't the kind of snow that signaled a bad week. It came in early December with a low wind that felt like knives pressed against skin. The flakes weren't soft. They were driven, tight-packed, like gravel thrown from the sky. Callum had just finished sealing the last cracks around the cabin's windows when the first real drifts came piling over the eaves. By morning, the back door was blocked in white. By the following day, the front one barely pushed open. The horses had already been moved into the lean-to, and Clara had piled straw under their bellies for warmth. But by day 3, the snow was higher than the roofline in places, and no one could leave. The path to town was gone. The fence lines had vanished. Trees bent under snow heavier than their branches could bear. At first, people assumed it would pass. A 3-day storm. Maybe 4. But when a week passed and the skies didn't open, panic crept in. The general store was cut off. The telegraph wire snapped. Most cabins were buried to the eaves, the smoke from their chimneys curling up through narrow gaps in the snow crust. Some settlers dug upward with shovels. Some used hatchets. Others gave up and stayed inside, chewing jerky and praying the coal would last. Clara and Callum sat warm. The stove glowed red and steady. She had stacked dried fruit in tin containers beneath the bed, between cracks in the wall, behind the stovepipe, and now it came out, handful by handful, sweet and preserved. Apple slices rehydrated in hot water and served with oats. Gooseberries softened over the fire and poured over stale cornbread. Even plums, those wrinkled things, now made into a thick paste, stirred into snowmelt tea. Callum blinked as he ate the first bowl. "Don't taste like winter," he murmured. "Tastes like July." Word spread fast. The first knock came on day 9. It was a boy, boots wet, cheeks blistered from frost, half crying and carrying an empty basket. "Ma says she'll trade wool socks for a jar of fruit," he mumbled. Clara gave him 2, no trade. "Tell your mother to keep her socks on. Don't send you out again." 2 days later, others came. A man with frozen fingers offered tools. A woman offered a silver brooch. One girl came just for the smell, just to sit inside for 20 minutes and warm her hands. Clara gave what she could. Not too much, not too fast. She rationed. She watched the shelves like they were gold. And outside, the town began to whisper again. But not laughter this time. They whispered about the bride who came with nothing but a pale suitcase and a canvas sack. The bride who'd been mocked for drying fruit like an old-world witch. The bride whose cabin glowed with warmth while other stoves went cold. And as the blizzard ground on, as roofs collapsed and fences vanished, and animals froze standing, the townspeople began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she'd known something all along. By the time the wind had died, the town was changed. What emerged after 12 days of blizzard was not just a valley blanketed in white, but a people subdued and quieted, humbled in a way that no barn-raising sermon or fire and brimstone preacher had ever managed. Trees had snapped in two like matchsticks. Wagons vanished under drifts higher than men. One roof collapsed entirely on the east side of town, and the man inside, who'd scoffed at the idea of storing more than beans and pork fat, was found alive but frostbitten down both feet. They dug themselves out slow. The paths were carved not by horses but by shovels, wheelbarrows, and sometimes bare hands. The church bell had frozen, cracked clean down one side. The general store was shuttered, its owner stuck inside with nothing but crackers and salt for the last week. And as folk began limping out of their cabins to find out who'd made it, one name kept coming up in murmured, almost reverent tones. "Clara Bellows," they said. No one called her the fruit widow now, not to her face, not behind her back. They said her name like you'd say a woman who knew something you didn't, something old, something maybe passed down from grandmothers before the land was mapped. She had saved not just herself and her husband, but half the town, quietly, without promise, without sermon. And she hadn't given it all away either. That surprised them. There was restraint in her kindness. Her husband's face, always unreadable, had become harder to read still. He didn't beam with pride or puff out his chest when people came calling. He just sat on the porch now, whittling wood as though the world hadn't changed, while his wife fed the frozen valley. By mid-January, the snow had only just begun to retreat, and food was scarce in more cabins than not. Clara's fruit reserves had dropped, yes, but she had enough for measured portions, careful meals, and slow-boiled stews that didn't taste like desperation. She had dried greens and even a jar of pickled dandelion heads that she stirred into the pot for brightness. In late January, when some of the men tried to trade Clara more than they could afford, lumber, bridles, hand-carved toys, even a watch, she refused every time. "I'm not a merchant," she said once. "I'm just trying to make the winter pass." But others resented her. They would not say it aloud, not yet, but there were stiff shoulders and averted eyes, and one man, William Griggs, made the mistake of calling her uppity in the blacksmith's shop one cold morning. Said no woman should be so proud of dried fruit, as if she'd single-handedly outwitted God. "I didn't see you feed the Heller kids when they were coughing blood from the cold," barked the blacksmith, a wiry woman named Bess Fenley. "She gave 'em plums soaked in honey. You got honey at your house, Griggs?" After that, he didn't speak of Clara again, but the tension lingered. A few whispered that maybe Clara knew the storm was coming, that maybe she'd known too much. One woman, Lydia Ames, insisted she'd seen Clara praying alone in the woods weeks before the snow, holding something wrapped in a cloth. "Could have been scripture," Lydia had muttered, "or could have been witchery." Truth was, Clara had done nothing strange. She'd simply been watching the sky, listening to the birds disappear too early, feeling the air turn tight in her lungs, watching the way the trees leaned east before snow ever touched bark. It was nothing taught, just remembered. She kept quiet about it, though. Let them guess. It was safer that way, until the meeting. It came up one afternoon in February, after the schoolhouse thawed enough to host gatherings again. The preacher, whose food had run out on the 5th day of snow and had been fed soup by Clara herself, called a town meeting under the guise of discussing the rebuilding of the church roof. But before the second matter of business, He said something that would change everything. "We ought to prepare better next time," he said, folding his hands. "And perhaps we ought to ask Mrs. Bellows to share her methods. Teach us all." He smiled gently at her across the room, but silence followed, a long one. Then a voice, sharp, male, bitter, said, "What makes her the expert? Maybe she just got lucky." It was Ezra Dill, a farmer whose horses hadn't survived the storm. She didn't feed everybody. She gave out what she wanted to who she liked. "That ain't wisdom, that's favoritism," he added, his lip twitching. Clara stood slowly. She hadn't spoken in public much. Her hands were still marked from stringing currants and slicing apples, red lines across her knuckles and fingers. She looked at Ezra. "I fed the Hellers because their children were sick. I gave to Ruby Marston's boy because he came barefoot in the cold. I turned away nobody who needed food, only those who came too proud to say they were hungry." Her voice was quiet, calm, but it landed hard. "And if you think that makes me cruel, I invite you next fall to dry your own fruit and feed the ones I missed." That silenced him. The preacher nodded. "Then it's decided. If you're willing, Clara, perhaps in spring, you might lead a group on food preservation. Teach what you know." She didn't answer right away. She glanced out the window at the melting snow, the way it reflected sun like crushed glass. The storm had passed, but its shadow lingered. "I'll teach it," she said, "but not in the church." Someone blinked. "Why not?" "Because some still believe I fed you through sorcery. I'd rather teach among the trees than under a roof where folks whisper curses into their hymn books." The preacher reddened, but said nothing, and it was agreed. That spring, as the frost retreated and the rivers cracked open with runoff, Clara began to lead small groups into the woods behind her cabin. She taught them how to spot wild fruits, how to dry them without rot, how to hang them beyond mice, how to layer cloth and oils to preserve without spoil. She showed them how to read the wind, the soil, the bird flight, how to smell snow on the breeze before it came. Not everyone listened, but some did, and those who did came back the next week and the next. The town changed again, not all at once, not like the storm had, but quietly, in increments. The women's circle began storing not just vegetables, but petals and herbs. Children learned how to string apple slices. The general store ordered bolts of cheesecloth and offered wax tins by fall, but not everyone was grateful. Some men, especially those who'd once joked the loudest, now avoided Clara altogether. Pride had kept them warm for years, and now they realized it was pride that nearly killed them. That kind of realization settles like rot in the bones. It turned into sour glances, muttered comments, and silence where thanks might have gone. But Clara had grown up with silence. It didn't bother her. What did bother her came one morning near the end of September, when she found something nailed to her door. It was a dead crow, split at the breastbone and hung with twine. Next to it was a note, scrawled in ugly ink, "Stay humble, fruit witch." Callum found it before she did. He burned the bird and the paper in the stove before she could read the full message, but the smoke lingered in the cabin like an omen. He looked at her that night across the small dinner table. "You want to leave?" he asked. She shook her head. "I left everything once. I won't run again." He nodded and said no more, but Clara began keeping her front door latched even during the day. She moved the jars of her next harvest, peach slivers, raspberries, mountain cherries, to a hidden root cellar beneath the floorboards. She taught fewer people that fall, only those she trusted. She wasn't afraid, not exactly, but she knew what hunger and shame could turn a man into. And she knew that the memory of that winter hadn't yet turned to reverence. It still stirred as resentment. The snow hadn't yet returned, but the air smelled dry again. The birds flew early, the trees leaned east, and Clara, standing on the porch with her bonnet tied against the wind, stared up at the ridge and whispered beneath her breath, "It's coming again." The second storm arrived before All Hallows' Eve, early and mean, without the usual weeks of warning frost that gave the prairie a chance to brace for it. Clara had sensed it before the clouds showed themselves, and this time she didn't wait to be proven right. On the morning the wind shifted and the birds vanished mid-migration, she locked the cabin from the inside and nailed thick hides over the windows. Callum watched her work without question. He no longer needed convincing. They were ready this time, more than ready. Her stores were double what they'd been the year before. She'd dried not just fruit, but bitter greens, wild roots, rhubarb, stewed pumpkin leather, and something she called winter meal, a mix of dried apples, oats, dried rosehip, and crushed nuts, packed into waxed cloth that could last through a siege. By mid-afternoon, snow had begun in a whisper, but fell steadily enough to smother the landscape before the sun dropped. Then the wind came, shrill, persistent, pushing white into the seams of the earth until fences were buried and outhouses lost their outlines. The town had not expected it so soon. She saw it from the high slit in her cabin wall where the stovepipe ran. The valley vanished, horizon to chimney, in a sea of white, but she and Callum were warm. She placed a clay brick oars baked and hot from the stove, under the straw tick of their shared bed, just like her mother had done in Tennessee during bitter winters. They had firewood, they had light, they had food. What they didn't have was silence. On the third night, someone pounded on the door after midnight. Not frantic, not pleading, just steady. Callum grabbed the rifle, but didn't raise it. Clara went to the door. It was Bess Fenley, the blacksmith, half frozen and cradling a bundle in her arms wrapped in quilt and snow. Behind her, barely visible in the whirling dark, stood her apprentice and two boys, with frost caked under their eyes. "We didn't prepare enough," Bess said flatly. "I thought I had time." Clara opened the door and stepped aside. That night, 5 slept on her floor, feet wrapped in extra socks, warmed by the steam of apple peel and juniper berry broth. Clara rationed without ceremony, drew no attention to her charity, but this time she kept a tally. On the 5th night, others came, and not just the kind ones. Ezra Dill came too, dragging his wife, who was near delirium from fever. He offered her nothing, no apology, no explanation, only stood outside in the wind until Callum waved him in. Clara fed them, but she said nothing. She marked his name down like the others. The storm lasted 13 days. 13. By then, Clara's cabin had become more than shelter. It was a citadel of survival, the last warm place within a day's walk. They slept stacked like firewood. At night, the only sound was breath and wind. Her stores dropped fast, faster than before, because this time she hadn't just fed a few, she fed nearly 20. She watched it drain her carefully layered bins and cloth-wrapped bundles. She watched the jars empty and the threads come down bare from the rafters. She calculated everything, calories, days, bodies, and still gave. And it was on the 12th night, with the last pot of dried apricot stew bubbling over a low flame, that she sat with Callum and finally spoke aloud what had been clawing at her heart. "I'll need help next year," she said quietly. "If I try to do this alone again, we'll die with them." He didn't flinch. He had changed too, from the silent widower who once assumed he'd die with a plow in his hands. He had watched her stand between death and an entire town, and not once had she asked for permission. "I'll help," he said. "No," she answered. "They will." When the snow cleared and the first weak paths opened toward the valley, Clara didn't wait for a preacher, didn't wait for a meeting or a council vote. She climbed atop her root cellar and nailed a board to the porch frame, painted with tar and lard-blackened soot. "Next time, you help or you starve." Some took offense, some muttered about how charity was becoming a toll booth, but none said it aloud in her presence. And that spring, something unprecedented happened. People came to her cabin and asked what to do. It wasn't just women now. It was boys, teenagers, even a few men, farmers, traders, hunters. They came to learn how she dried fruit so thoroughly, how she kept jars sealed without rot, how she preserved so much in so little space. She showed them how to dig a proper underground storehouse and line it with bark and canvas to prevent flooding. She taught them to string food high, not low, to build hooks into the rafters. She even taught a few how to build a double-door airlock system that held warmth longer. She made them practice. When someone offered to pay her for the knowledge, she said no. "When I die, this dies if it's only mine," she said. "You want to repay me? Teach it to your daughter, or marry a woman who will." But not all change came peacefully. That summer, Ruby Marston accused Clara of making herself too important. She called it setting herself up as some kind of snow queen. "She hoards, teaches who she wants, feeds who she favors," Ruby hissed during a summer barn gathering. "A woman like that should be watched." Callum, who had spent years speaking only when necessary, stood and said just loud enough to be heard, "The woman you call the Snow Queen saved your child's life. If you're going to spit on that, at least have the dignity not to do it with your mouth full." No one challenged him again, but Clara knew how fast respect could turn sour in a place where winters killed more people than war. She stayed humble in her demeanor. She dressed plainly, never spoke too long in gatherings, refused praise, always passed the credit back to nature or tradition or what my mama taught me. But she continued to prepare, this time with others. By August, she had 50 families drying fruit. By September, every home in the valley had at least one hook nailed into the rafters. And by October, they began calling the approach to her cabin Preservation Hill. That's when someone tried to burn it. It happened in the night. A lantern left burning too long or placed too close to the root cellar. Callum caught the smell first. Smoke. Not from their stove, but something acrid. They ran outside and found the storage hatch smoldering, the hinges blackened, and one of the bins inside turned to wet ash. They extinguished it in time. Not all was lost, but the message had been clear. Clara didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. She stood in the dirt, watching the smoke curl into the stars, then said calmly, "Next time, I'll hang a bell over the door, and I'll guard it." That winter came late, But it came hard. Ice storms before snow. Horses broke legs on glass-slick paths. One boy died chasing a loose chicken and sliding into a ravine. The valley shut down fast, but it didn't starve, because this time, every house had fruit, every child had dried apples tucked into sacks, every hearth had jars wrapped in blankets to keep the seals intact. Clara had made herself unnecessary. That was her greatest success. But they still came to her. One night in December, Callum found her sitting by the fire, hands clasped, eyes distant. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, but then she said, "I keep thinking about that first winter, how close we came, how none of them thought to ask why I was storing all that, just laughed." He nodded slowly. "They laugh when they don't understand. Then they resent when they do." She looked at him, eyes sharp. "You resent me?" He smiled for the first time in weeks, small, crooked, but real. "No, I thank God you came, and I thank you more." Then he reached under the cot and drew out a box he'd built himself, poorly nailed but sturdy. Inside was a gift he'd been saving. Dried persimmons she hadn't seen him take. Rare, expensive, traded for in town, in exchange for his hand-forged nails. So he handed it to her. She opened it and stared. "You dried these?" He nodded. She looked back at him, and her eyes filled just slightly. "You did it wrong," she said. "They're supposed to be halved before drying." "I know," he said. "I wanted to see if you'd scold me." She laughed. First time in weeks. That night they ate fruit together under oil lamplight, and for the first time in months, it tasted like more than survival. It tasted like proof. Clara Bellows had changed the valley. She'd arrived with a sack and a past no one asked about. She had stayed through snow and fear and smoke. And now, as the storm whistled outside and cabins glowed across the dark valley, the laughter that once mocked her had gone silent, replaced by something stronger, gratitude. And still she kept watch on the sky, because she knew this land wasn't done testing them yet. The third winter was worse than any they had seen, not because the snow was deeper. It wasn't, nor was the cold more brutal, though it was biting enough. No, what made that year dangerous wasn't nature. It was what people assumed about it. They thought they were ready. They weren't. Complacency had settled in like dust. The first year they'd nearly died. The second year they'd survived. Barely. By the third, many had forgotten the shape of hunger. They thought their jars would last, their cellars wouldn't flood, and the cold would come late like before. They saw the skies hold sun longer and the winds stay still through October, and they mistook it for mercy. Clara knew better. She watched it from her porch, arms crossed, bonnet tied tight. Callum had carved her a bench now, wide enough for them both, and she sat on it every evening after supper, not knitting, not sewing, just watching. The sky, the tree line, the birds. It wasn't what was there that worried her. It was what wasn't. There were no crickets that fall, no hummingbirds either. The chipmunks that usually darted around the edge of the pasture vanished by mid-September. The wind didn't come often, but when it did, it carried a low howl beneath it. Not the kind trees made, but something thinner, deeper. She started preparing in silence. Callum didn't ask. He saw her face and knew. They doubled their efforts. Again, the root cellar was now twice as deep, with new shelves and sealed walls lined with clay and straw. They had added a second roof of sod to insulate the cabin. Clara laid in not only fruit and greens this time, but bundles of wild onion and garlic braided together like ropes, small bundles of dried river fish traded from a Cree woman who passed through in spring, even dried squash seeds pressed into honey and cured. She built tiny heat pockets inside the walls, using brick and sand to retain warmth after the fire died. It was the kind of detail that people didn't notice when they visited, until they sat too close and felt the walls hum with heat. Still, she said nothing to the town. She didn't hang a sign. She didn't call meetings. She didn't offer to teach. The second winter had humbled them, but not changed them. Some still resented her. Others tolerated her like a relic, something useful but hard to love. A few younger families admired her, even tried to imitate her discipline. But mostly people had gone back to pride. They dried fruit, yes, but too little. They stored oats, but not salt. They trusted that survival once meant survival always. And then the river froze early, before the harvest was in. November came in like a hammer, cracking down without warning. The sun vanished behind grey, and the sky opened not with flurries but with sleet. The fields, still bearing the last of the squash and late potatoes, turned to ice. Horses slipped in the pasture. Axes bounced off frozen logs like blunt tools. By the second week, it was clear. The harvest was ruined. By the third, it was clear. This wasn't just a storm. This was the long winter. They would not be able to trade. The nearest town was 4 days on foot, and now impassable. The store had sold out of sugar and flour by the second snow. One man, George Petty, who had mocked Clara's warning signs in the summer, was now trying to boil tree bark for soup. Still, they didn't come to her. Not yet. They tried to ration what they had. They cut corners. They burned their furniture. They told stories around empty hearths and pretended that memories could feed the stomach. But Clara kept her door shut. She and Callum ate quietly. She rationed harder than ever. She made stews so thin they looked like tea, stretched dried currants across loaves that could last 4 days. She didn't touch her emergency bundles. Not yet. The first knock didn't come until Christmas Eve. It was a woman named Mina Jurgens, a young widow with 2 small boys. She had traded her last boots for potatoes 2 weeks ago and now stood barefoot, tears frozen on her face. Clara didn't speak. She opened the door and took the boys in first, rubbing their feet with warm cloth, then fed them broth 1 spoonful at a time. Mina wept quietly at the threshold. "I don't have anything to give." "You brought your children," Clara said. "That's enough." From there, the others came fast, not with bluster, with silence, shame, frozen faces and empty eyes. One by one, or in 2s and 3s, they showed up at her door. She didn't ask questions. She didn't turn them away, but she watched. She noted who offered help in return, who tried to chop wood, who washed dishes, who cared for the sick, and she noted who didn't. Ezra Dill came again, this time alone, his wife long dead from fever in October, and his face drawn like stretched canvas. He said nothing as Clara handed him a slice of dried peach. "You never should have made it," he said hoarsely. "No," Clara said, "but I did, and that was the end of it. That winter." Clara became something more than the woman who dried fruit. She became the judge of the valley, not by law, not by decree, but by action. People came not just for food, but for instruction. She made them earn it. "You want dried pears? Fix the door hinges. You want apricot paste? Teach my student how to clean roots. You want a warm place to sleep? Patch the roof over the pantry." It wasn't cruelty, it was structure. And it worked. The town didn't just survive. It moved. It functioned. People started copying her model. By January, other cabins had hung signs like hers. Work equals food. Not all had the same stores, but the spirit caught. Children learned to string apple slices. Men learned to build dry cellars. Women shared pickling tricks and bitter root tea recipes. But not everyone learned. One night, Clara woke to the sound of her cellar hatch creaking. She rose quietly, lifted the rifle from beneath the bed, and slipped outside. It was dark, windless, the kind of dark that eats sound. She found him halfway into the cellar, a burlap sack in hand, face masked by scarf. "Step back," she said. The man froze. "I said back," he obeyed. When she peeled his scarf away, she found a face she recognized. William Griggs's boy, only 17. He looked down. "I wasn't gonna take much," he said. "Just some plums for Ma." Clara said nothing. She lowered the rifle slowly. Then she handed him a small jar. "Take this," she said, "but tell your ma to send you next time. And knock." The boy nodded, face red with shame. "Stealing in summer is sin," she said. "Stealing in winter is death. Don't make me choose next time." He ran. She told no one. Because Clara understood what no one else dared say aloud. If you turn someone away when they're starving, they will become a thief. And if you shame them for their hunger, they'll become worse. That spring, when the snow melted and the fields opened like wounds, there was no celebration. There was only rebuilding and something else. Clara Bellows was offered leadership, unofficial, but real. A council seat, a vote, a place in decisions. Callum was offered land to expand. A few even asked if they'd consider building a schoolhouse with Clara as teacher. She refused most of it. "I didn't feed you to lead you," she said. "I fed you because you needed it." But she did say one thing at the spring gathering, as they laid plans for next winter. "This town has seen 2 things, famine and pride. If we forget either, we deserve to starve again." They listened. They would never laugh at her again. By the 4th winter, Clara Bellows had become legend, not the kind that sits on a shelf or rusts in a newspaper column, the kind that breathes beside you when the wind turns mean and the sky lowers like a threat. Children in the valley were raised on tales of her apple strings and black currant jars. People walked the wooded paths behind her cabin like pilgrims, whispering her name not out of fear or reverence, but something more grounded. Respect earned the hard way. She never asked for it. She never raised her voice to claim it. But when the valley met that winter, the 4th and last Clara would see in this town, they did so differently. For the first time, they were ready. They had learned. Root cellars were no longer rare. They were expected. Hooks in the rafters, double doors, heat-retaining stone walls, emergency bundles wrapped in beeswax cloth. All of it had spread like survival scripture. Some called it Clara's way. Others didn't call it anything. They just lived it. And Clara? She had begun to pull back. By late summer, she no longer taught lessons. She left it to the younger women and a few good men who had studied under her for 3 winters. She no longer traded goods or oversaw storage prep. She spent more time on the ridge, gathering herbs or checking the wind. She began writing in a leather-bound journal no one was allowed to touch. Only Callum knew the truth. She was sick. It had begun in late spring, a tremble in her hands when she strung berries, a shortness of breath after a long climb. a light-headed spell that sent her to her knees while harvesting wild onions. She hid it well, kept her posture straight, her voice firm, but Callum saw. He asked once, in the hush of a hot July night, "Do you think it's time to tell someone?" She had smiled. "I already have," she said. "I've told them everything they need." He didn't argue. By September, she'd lost weight, her cheeks thinned, her steps slowed, but her eyes stayed sharp. She watched the valley like a hawk on a high post, not to control it, not to rule it, but to know it. She could tell, for instance, who was slacking on their root preservation just by the color of the soil at the edge of their cellar. She knew which homes had sealed their jars too late by the scent of the wind when it passed over the west end of town. She even predicted the illness that struck in October, rot gut fever, before the doctor smelled it. "Bess Fenley's boy is too quiet," she'd said, walking past his house. "He's sick. Tell his mother to boil his drinking water." The doctor laughed. 2 days later, 5 children were down with fever. Only 3 survived. The town stopped questioning her after that, but Clara wasn't trying to prove anything. She was preparing, quietly, steadily. She knew this was her last season. She had Callum build one last addition, not to the cabin, but to the cellar, a small room, no bigger than a cot, sealed with clay and lined with canvas. She packed it with her journal, 4 sealed tins of preserved fruit, a flint striker, 2 wool blankets, and a note, "For the one who remembers." She told no one. Then she did something strange. She packed a trunk, not with clothes, but with dried fruit, peaches, sliced and wrapped, apples, cured with cinnamon, raspberries, soaked in honey and sun-dried to a leathery sweetness, apricots pressed between wood and wax paper, currants, still dark and plump from the harvest. She left it locked and placed it in the town hall during a gathering, covered with a cloth and a sign. "Open only when there is no other food left." People laughed nervously, thought it was symbolic, but Clara said nothing. She simply walked out after that, hand wrapped around Callum's elbow. They didn't see much of her after that. And then, one morning in mid-November, Callum came to town alone. He posted a single slip of paper to the church door. "Clara Bellows has passed. Her final request, prepare as she taught you, store as if it matters. Feed your children like you loved them before they were born." No ceremony, no sermon, no burial site. She had asked to be cremated, quietly, without notice, and Callum had done it. The town stood still for a day. No one rang bells, no one gathered in the square. They just stood in silence. Every home, every cabin, every root cellar paused in memory. And then they moved. They dried more fruit that year than ever before. They sealed jars tighter, packed bins deeper, dug their cellars longer. They took her words and etched them into wooden plaques, hung in every kitchen. "Store as if it matters." The winter came hard. Not brutal, not deadly, but hard enough, and the town was ready. They opened the trunk in the town hall, not because they were starving, but to taste what she'd left, a reminder, a gift. They split the fruit into tiny portions. Every child got 1 sliver. Every adult took only after the children. Some cried when they tasted it, not for the sweetness, for the memory. Years passed. New settlers came. Old names faded, but the method stayed. Root cellars became law. Dried fruit became currency. The ridge where her cabin once stood became known not as Preservation Hill, but simply Clara's Rise. No one laughed anymore. No one dared. And when children asked who she was, they were told the truth. She was a mail-order bride who came with a suitcase and a sack. She stored 500 pounds of fruit. They laughed. And then the snow trapped the town, and she, alone, saved it.